Well, hello everyone, and today we talk about Gothic. Gothic that appeared towards the middle of the 12th century, and we know exactly where. Right here in Paris, or more precisely in the northern suburb of Paris, Saint-Denis. Today it's part of larger Paris, it's part of the industrial suburb of Paris, but at the time it was just outside the city walls. And it began by an Abbot Suger, who was a very important person in the French kingdom, a friend of, an advisor of Louis VI and then Louis VII. Of unlikely background, he came from a humble background, but he was apprenticed at Saint-Denis, and there he met the young Louis VII, and the friendship continued all their lives. Well, once the Gothic began, it will never stop, really. Until today, buildings are still built in the Gothic style, and it will become the most original style, well, since antiquity. Nothing like this had ever happened before, because while around the Mediterranean the buildings seemed to be low and strutting the earth, it is in the north that they soared to heavens. During the Renaissance in Italy, particularly Vasari, the first art historian, called the Gothic a barbarous style that could only be invented by Germanic barbarians. And well, by Germanic, what was meant was anything to the north of the Alps, essentially. Because they felt that living in forests, they emulated the trees in their architecture. And interestingly enough, even though it was meant as a pejorative description, Gothic, they weren't entirely wrong, because, well, the forests were the original dwelling of humanity, and many elements of architecture were indeed borrowed from nature. When we think of the Corinthian style in Greece, that was borrowed from a plant, the acanthus plant. And yes, when we think of Gothic architecture, when we walk inside a Gothic temple, those columns seem like trunks of trees. So they meant it as pejorative, as a pejorative title, Gothic, but, well, as so many misnomers, it is here with us to stay. And well, it was invented in France. France, well, to Italians, as I said, anything north of the Alps was Germanic, and, well, the Franks were originally a Germanic tribe. And interestingly, politically, up in the north, starting with Hugh Capet, circa a year 1000, the French kings owned the smallest of the lots, the area around Paris, called the Ile-de-France. But the Capetian kings began to assert themselves, and whether by clever political moves or by marriages, they began to assert themselves with the barons, and forming a strong alliance with the church, which was hereditary for the Frankish kings, and even the Vatican, as we remember with Charlemagne, when the Pope crowned Charlemagne emperor. The Abbot Suger, whom I had mentioned, seems to have been a very ambitious and very capable man, and he felt that this self-assurance that the Capetians, that the French kings began to project, must also be projected through the church. And Saint-Denis was actually the first church in France, with the relics of Saint-Denis, who sometime in the 4th, 5th centuries was the one to convert France to Christianity. And as such, Suger felt that it has to be worthy of its legacy. Now, the abbot before him was an intellectual and not much worried about architecture, and let the building essentially dilapidate. And Suger wasn't going to have it. He wanted to rebuild it. This also coincided, this whole process also coincided with something else that was very important. Not only political unification, the beginning of the political unification and the alliance of the crown with the church, but there was also the growth of so-called scholasticism, and in the 12th century this philosophy will begin to flourish, and will flourish even more so in the 13th century, which also coincides with the height of Gothic architecture. It's a school of reasoning that's based on highly intellectualized systems of logic and metaphysics. By this time, the writings of Aristotle were translated to Latin from Arabic, because they came from the Arabs. The original Greek texts will not reach Europe until considerably later. And the highest, the pinnacle of scholasticism was the so-called Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas. And this is just a vast compendium of all existing knowledge at the time, and the vast compendium of knowledge about Christianity and the Christian Church. And essentially that's what today's Catholic theology is still very much based on. So here to scholasticism, it combined classical pagan philosophy, mainly Greek, but also some of its Roman offshoots, with additions from Hebrew texts, with additions from Arabic texts. It was truly a compendium of knowledge, and its original purpose was to reconcile Christian dogma with Aristotelian rationality. That's how it began, and that's what Thomas Aquinas attempted to do as well. But then, as I said, with the additions, all these flavorings of the Jewish and Islamic intellectual heritages, often it seemed as if the scholars bit more than they could chew, because it's just that some of those tenets were irreconcilable, as Renaissance ultimately will show. So there were three basic tenets that underlay the Summa, and one was idealism, which forms sort of the basis of definitions of Thomas Aquinas, and many scholars have found parallels between Gothic architecture and scholasticism. So they see this same idealism in the treatment of much of Gothic mature sculpture. Another tenet that's very, very important is the vastness of knowledge. I mean, truly, for the times, this was encyclopedic. And this also is conveyed in much of the portal and the tympana sculpture and decoration that belongs to the Gothic cathedrals. In fact, so much is there that often even the scholars do not quite know which is the allegory for what, etc. But there are, all of them, iconographic programs. I mean, the entire human knowledge was in fact expressed in a Gothic cathedral. And then there was also this dialectical structuring that Aquinas employed, and in providing arguments and counter-arguments. And Gothic architecture does show that as well in its in its very scaffolding stone system. In other words, when one looks at the shaft, for instance, so it rains, one sees supports and counter supports throughout the entire building. Wherever there is a pressure, this pressure is counterbalanced by a support, by a flying buttress. So that also is very much conveyed in the Gothic architecture. But back to idealism, what they also felt very much, the scholastics, is that the world seems to have been created according to geometric patterns, and science, in particular geometry and astronomy, for them was linked directly to the divine revelation. And since God created the universe according to geometric patterns, then they must influence the creation of the churches, the temples of God, the so-called the New Jerusalems, also according to geometric patterns. And the basic square, for instance, and the number 4, well, countless examples, the 4 evangelists, the 4 seasons of the year, the 4 rivers of paradise, the 4 elements of nature, the 4 humors, the 4 cardinal points, etc., etc. Then the circle, there is no end and no beginning. It is eternal, as God is eternal. Triangle conveys the basic Trinitarian symbolism of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And then some scholars also posited the so-called great speculi, the great mirrors. And one of the most important mirror would be history of Christianity. Then other speculi would be nature, doctrine, morals. And as I started the lecture earlier, much of a Gothic cathedral is based on nature, is based on the trunks of the trees and the mysticism of a forest, the darkness of the forest, darkness on the one hand, on the other hand, when the sunlight comes through the verdure, the impression is extraordinary, and again mystical. So, and all of this is very much part of the Gothic cathedral. And thus we go to our Abbot Suger, the great reformer, and unlike Bernard of Clairvaux, whom I had mentioned in earlier lectures, or Bernard Clairvaux of the 12th century, who very much embraced the absence of art. He is the one who decried the Romanesque capitals, saying, goodness, what are all these creatures? None of them exist in Christianity. This is absolutely horrifying. Well, Suger was the opposite of that. He self-flagellation certainly was not for him, and self-denial wasn't either. And he very much equated art and splendor with the Christian worship. And he also very much believed in light, in a divine light, in lux nova, which he equated with mysticism. His fascination with light was not just merely aesthetic. Just as many other clerics in the 12th century, he was a follower of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who was alive in the 6th century. There were some documents found in the cathedral library, and at first he was confused with the first saint, Saint-Denis, and so the theory of light became all the more important in the mind of these clerics. And Pseudo-Dionysius equated even the slightest reflection of light, a glint, with divine light. Once it was renovated, Saint-Denis actually included Suger's own words carved in the nave For bright is that which is brightly coupled with the bright, and bright is the noble edifice which is pervaded by the new light, lux nova. The cathedral that Suger inherited was very small and, as I said, quite dilapidated, very noble origins, the first church in France. Also, Charlemagne's father, the Emperor Pepin, was buried there, which of course was also of great importance. And well, it had an apse. It was already a whole cathedral, a whole church. So Suger decided to start with the front, and this was the projected plan for the front, with the two towers right here. With time, as always happened with these cathedrals, people die, plans change, other people come to be building the church, and ultimately the south tower was exactly as was planned, but then the north tower went upwards. And today there is no north tower, and the reason for that was because it was considered unsafe, and therefore it was removed in the middle of the 19th century. All the stones, however, were saved for the rebuilding of the tower. Well, it hasn't been rebuilt yet. So he built, Suger did the narthex right here, and then the second phase, the first phase was the west front right here, and the west front is still, as you see, largely Romanesque. Then the second phase, and between 1140 and 1144. Now this is the new Gothic. He also projected the nave, but well, he died before that happened, and the nave ultimately became the High Gothic of the 13th century. But the narthex is that of Suger, and the apse is that of Suger. Here we are looking at the front. Here it is today, and even though the facade itself is still Romanesque, the church is considered the beginning of Gothic, and as I said, it will become extremely popular. It will be consistent, incredibly competitive, because once Suger did his apse, everybody else followed. Long-lasting, even today, buildings are still built in Gothic. It was unique, as I said, it was the first original style since antiquity, and very, very expressive. What you see today, these are medieval buildings here. The same arc is seen here. And here's a plan of the church today. And what you see here in shading, in light shading, this was the original church. And it was very narrow, and it was very small. So first, Suger did his narthex. It seems that the Emperor Pepin asked not to be there inside the church, but outside the doors, and it only had one single door, to expiate the sins of his father, Charles Martel. But Suger, by building this large narthex, also included the burial of the Emperor Pepin. And the great facade that he had built was really to convey the greatness of the Capetians, the greatness of the royal house. But then the apse that he will build will proclaim the greatness of the church. And the two of them thus were united in the renovation of the kingdom, both civil and ecclesiastical. So here's the original church, as you see, and here is Suger's church. He kept the old crypt and raised the apse above it. There were many churches in this place, but then the church that Suger was renovating was Carolingian. The narthex then comes from 1140 then Chevet right here is from 1144, and then the nave will be done in the 13th century. And here you are. In the middle of the 19th century, authorities decided to temporarily dismantle the North Tower because it was deemed unsafe. Well, they were actually finally going to rebuild the North Tower before the fire happened at the Notre Dame, and then of course all the resources were thrown on the Notre Dame, so we don't know when that tower might be rebuilt. But this was the building until the middle of the 19th century. And as you see, the church itself, the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, is not that different from Saint-Etienne in Caen that we saw, which was the church of William the Conqueror. Except the stone massiveness of Saint-Etienne is now perforated with openings. It's perforated with more windows, as you see, and so is the same with towers, even though the tower here, the North Tower here and the North Tower there are quite similar. And one of the great innovations in Saint-Denis is the rose window. It seems that the Carolingian monarchs in their palaces, they had the so-called window of appearances, sort of like a balcony. We have a balcony at Buckingham Palace where the royalty shows themselves. We have the balcony at the Vatican where the Pope, or the window at the Vatican where the Pope shows himself. And so there was a window for the Carolingian kings to show themselves. And it seems that that's where the idea of the rose window originated, except this window was not for the king to show himself, but for the god, because the window is round, the beginning and the end, no beginning and no end, eternal. And that's where the rose window seems to have originated. And the basic structure of the facade, as you see the Saint-Etienne, is all based on squares and divisions of three. There are pilasters here, these very heavy stone masonry pillars that divide the facade into three parts, very similarly to the way they do it here, except, as I said, Saint-Denis is more perforated. Still, the appearance is largely Romanesque, and therefore it is a transitional architecture. And now we come to the Chevet itself, right here, the choir and the ambulatory of Saint-Denis, and that's where Gothic really kicks in, because one might notice the simple fact that the walls have disappeared. Instead of the walls, what we have are windows. And where the original chapels were, each chapel an individual unit in older churches, today, here, they are radiating chapels, yes, but they represent a glass cage. And as a result, this becomes the architecture of supports, essentially, because these very large piers and the columns hold up the ceiling. Whoever the architect was, and we don't know his name, unfortunately, he designed the choir with these very sturdy ribs, and here the ribs actually do have a function. They seem to be bearing ribs, because Suger left a record that once only ribs were in place, and there was a great storm and he was very worried, but the ribs in fact stood and did not collapse. And then between the ribs there is a web of masonry. Also, by choosing a pointed vaulting, the architect was able to direct the forces of the vault where he wished them to be directed. And also the pointed vault could be raised or lowered to whichever height one desired, simply because it was not connected to the letter pi, to the constant pi that connects the circumference to the diameter in a regular circle. And here you have it. These are the apsidial chapels, the radiating chapels. There are 9 of them all together. And then there's also a double ambulatory that one can walk around. Here's the apse itself and the double ambulatory, and the quay is raised somewhat over the old crypt. And as you see, there's a staircase there on each side. There are spiral staircases that take you down. And here it is. Again, the architecture of supports. That's what Saint-Denis became. Because Sujet was so particular about light, stained glass window was already used in the Romanesque churches, but here it was used even to a greater extent. And he realized, of course, that stained glass actually dims the light, but that wasn't important. The importance was in the quality of the light changing as it comes through a stained glass. And in Sujet's mind, it was similar to incarnation, just as Gabriel's words reached Mary's ear and incarnation happened within her body without breaking her virginity. So here, light comes through these windows and is transformed without breaking the windows. So stained glass became extremely important. And this is the groin vaulting. These are the groins. I mean, you've seen this before. Various parts of what was employed in Gothic, various architectural parts, as we had seen, were already used in Romanesque churches, but no one thought of bringing them all together and then taking the next step, and that's what Sujet did. The masonry webbing is here. Here are the groins right there. You can see them here. I suspect it depends from church to church whether the ribs are the actual structural members or they are expressive elements of the work of art. And in England, they are mostly expressive and decorative, but in France, they were often structural. We are very lucky to have this apse survive, because the facade, I mean, the basic bones are very much those of the original design, but after the French Revolution in the early 19th century, it was restored, the facade, and it seems that the restorations were not very good, and so it's hard to really to tell which were the original sculptures. We now go to a place called Laon, right there to the north of Paris, right here. And here we see a cathedral, which is very dramatic. And this cathedral was done directly after Sujet's Saint-Denis. And as I said, the competitive momentum was so powerful that, I mean, the moment something was designed, everybody else knew about it. And plus the same companies of masons traveled from one place to the other, exchanging experiences and using their experiences. So Laon was built right after Saint-Denis, but in much more dramatic expression. The economy of the town was booming, and there was one Anselm of Laon who was a very renowned scholastic, and who founded there the school of theology that attracted many students to Laon. And besides, the Laon's communal charter was re-established in 1130. By the 12th century, the towns are growing, and Gothic cathedrals, in fact, are connected to towns, much more so than Romanesque, because Romanesque churches, Romanesque cathedrals often belong to monastic communities. But now the center of learning and the center of activities is moving away from these monastic communities to the cities, and that too spurred the advance of Gothic. What the towners did, they placed sculptures of the bulls on top of their cathedral, which is very charming. These supposedly are the bulls who logged the masonry, who logged the stones and the wood and did all the labor in building the Laon Cathedral, and as a result their sculptures are there. And here you can see it better, right there. The interior of Laon, as you see, it is a six-partite vault right here. And this is the elevation. This is called the elevation. It consists of naval arcade, the gallery, as we saw it in Romanesque cathedrals. Here is a triforium, which is blind arches, just so that less masonry strikes the eye, so that instead of a plain wall, the wall is perforated, and the light, just as the light hits the perforations and hits the and creates light and shade, which is very dramatic, so human eye as well is not dulled by a monotonous wall. And then the clerestory, right here. The cathedral seems to have had the original round apse at first, but later on it was converted to a rectilinear apse, and when you have your PowerPoint you may read about the details. This is what's called elevation, as I said, when one looks at the elevation. And the difference between the Laon Cathedral and later cathedrals that we'll be looking at as they developed. And as I said, it's a four-partite elevation. Here's the naval arcade, then the gallery, then the triforium, then the clerestory. In later churches, and they will also be higher, but for our purposes, this just shows you how things will change. The naval arcade will rise, the triforium will drop a bit, the gallery will disappear altogether. Instead of the gallery, the roof that abuts the vault, that will be supplanted with a flying buttress. And then the instead of the clerestory as we see it in Laon, we'll have the so-called plate tracery, where the two windows will be replaced with these lancets, as they're called, and then still another rows will be introduced above the lancets, and the whole thing will be called plate tracery. And therefore the wall will appear even more immaterial than it did in Laon. We now go to Paris, and Paris will be the first cathedral to use the flying buttresses. The construction began slightly after Laon, and then it will continue for 100 years. And then later on, as a result of structural damage or fires, it will be rebuilt several times. So as I said, one of the first to use the flying buttresses. It was not originally designed for flying buttresses, but once the walls were in place and it appeared that they were not stable, the architect then came up with the idea how to abut the walls, and then the flying buttresses appeared. The structure is similar. We had seen something similar like this before, and it is still subdivided into basic squares and circles. Suger introduced dramatic entrances. Suger introduced the tripartite entrance, just as was the case with many Romanesque cathedrals. But here the sculpture, the portal sculpture, is increased even compared to Saint-Denis. There's portal sculpture is everywhere. Here is a row of kings and queens of France. They were destroyed during the French Revolution. Today these are copies, and whatever was left of the old ones are in a nearby museum. The rose now is introduced here, and then there are lancet windows that light up the nave as well. And the story right here begins to look like lace, with two spectacular towers. And here it is, and here are the flying buttresses. These were the first, and whatever was done here later was rebuilt. But the original flying buttresses were here in Notre Dame. Once Notre Dame was built, there was a point at which Saint Louis, who was Louis IX, who ruled through the 13th century, he acquired some spectacular relics from Constantinople that I will mention later, and he wished to build a reliquary essentially for those relics. But while Sainte-Chapelle, as it will be called, was being built, he deposited the relics here in Notre Dame. The majority of Gothic cathedrals will be dedicated to Our Lady, and they will all be called Notre Dame, but we know the Paris Notre Dame because, of course, of Victor Hugo and then various films and animations too. If you look at the two of them, you can see why the Laon Cathedral appears much more dramatic, because with the Paris Notre Dame, all the divisions are very clearly marked, and yet they're very sustained, they're very reticent, they are there for one to recognize them, but they're not there to overwhelm one. One is overwhelmed once one is inside, whereas with the Laon Cathedral, one is overwhelmed from the very beginning, right here. If you look how deep the portals are, not only the portals, but also the rows and the lancets at each end, and even the towers as well. The entire facade of Laon is the play on light and shade, whereas with the Paris Cathedral, it's much more restrained, as I said. But the basic structure is still there. And here we have something quite interesting in Notre Dame of Paris. It began, here's the elevation, it began as a four-partite elevation. Naval arcade, then the gallery. Instead of triforium, they had these blind rose windows, and then the clerestory, sort of like Laon. But soon enough, while the cathedral was still being built, because as I said, Gothic was so innovative, soon enough they abandoned the rose and they extended the clerestory down to create the plate tracery, as you see it here, and also then to transform the elevation into the three-partite elevation. So now we have the naval arcade, the gallery, and then the clerestory that now has joined with triforium. And you can see it in the actual cathedral as well. Here is the old four-partite elevation right here, and here is the later three-partite elevation. Because the cathedral, it had to be large, but still Paris was becoming a large city, and Paris was also a great center for scholasticism with great teachers. So the transept could really not be extended much, and therefore the transept, as you see, is almost flush with the body of the cathedral. It is still a six-partite vault, right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the six-partite vault, as you may notice, embraces two bays. Not one bay, two bays. And Paris still has the six-partite vault. It still has the columns with what appears to be Corinthian capitals, but they're more stylized Corinthian. The gallery, and here is the clerestory. This, as you see, the nave was already built with the clerestory. Here it is again, the six-partite, so you can see it. So the ribs here are extended between the two bays, and then the masonry web is placed on top of the ribs, as you can see it here. The flying buttresses of the apse here, the present ones, date from the 14th century. And here is the schematic of the flying buttresses of Paris. And it was an incredible innovation of the 13th century, because what will happen with them is that the vault and the pressure of the vault will be met by the flying buttress everywhere. And this is what I meant when I was saying that the dialectic of Thomas Aquinas in a way corresponded to the stresses and counter-stresses of a Gothic cathedral, because the dialectic is based on thesis, counter-thesis, and synthesis. And then the whole thing begins again, and that's how the Summa Theologica is written. And one sees it in Gothic cathedrals as well, because here is the pressure of the bolt, the thesis, then the counter-thesis, the skeleton that picks up that pressure, and then the whole thing becomes stable. Very often Gothic cathedrals are in fact called scaffolding in stone, because the scaffolding, you see it everywhere. So when the 20th century decided to denude the basic structure that usually is hidden inside the walls, such as the Pompidou Center in Paris, they really weren't doing anything new, frankly, because the Gothic cathedral had already done that. Just as the Gothic cathedral, as we will see, was the first skyscraper. Now, architects originally did use these multiple gargoyles with very, very long necks, because, well, they were used as water conduits away from the cathedral. And that's how they are, in fact, used. And what's interesting also is that an architect actually appears at about this time, in the 12th century. If earlier we have master mason who is in charge of all construction, now we actually have architects. Now, gargoyles are not to be confused with chimeras. So the very famous, what we call gargoyles from the Hunchback of Notre Dame, so what we call gargoyles are actually chimeras. They are not functional. And these chimeras on Notre Dame actually date to the 19th century. Now, the term gargoyle originates from the French word gargouille, which is where we get the word for gargle, meaning throat or gullet. And the related English words are, well, gargle and gurgle. And gargoyles serve the practical purpose of carrying the rainwater, but chimeras are decorative. The most famous creatures are chimeras, in fact, not gargoyles. And this is just another beautiful slide of the Chevette of Notre Dame. And now we go to Chartres, and also Notre Dame, Our Lady of Chartres. And it replaced, well, as it happens, at least 5 churches that were there before. The site seems to have had a church there since the 4th century. For the most part, it is a perfect example of High Gothic, even though Romanesque elements still persist here as well. Here it is, and it does have a transept. It has an enormous choir and then the apse. And you may notice that in the nave, the 6-partite vault is now replaced with a 4-partite vault that only covers one bay, right there. Here it is, and Chartres, now here is Paris. Chartres is just due west, right there. Still another very famous theological school in the Middle Ages. It was in fact established in the 11th century by Bishop Fulbert. Established Chartres as a cathedral school, and very important school for both for the religious scholarship and theology, and as a result attracted a lot of students, and all of them were in the forefront of the intense intellectual rethinking that culminated in what is now known as the 12th century Renaissance. The 12th century is considered the Renaissance of the Middle Ages, and then 13, 14 are the later Middle Ages. pioneering the scholastic philosophy. This is a figure of Pythagoras on one of the arch vaults, and we'll look at them as well. Well, if you look at the facade, you still see Romanesque features. You still see the round arches that top the windows right here. At some point in the late 9th century, it seems that the cathedral, the Carolingian Cathedral, acquired a very sacred relic, Sancta Camisa, which was believed to be a tunic worn by the Blessed Virgin. Now, as you see, it too has two towers, and the south tower is very similar to the one in Cayenne and also the one in Saint-Denis, and it's a beautiful, straightforward tower. The other one is done in much more flamboyant, literally flamboyant Gothic. That's what it will be called in the 14th century, right here. And up until the towers, the front is rather consistent. As you see, the tripartite entrance with slight pointed tympanum, and then great windows on top that light up the nave, a rose right here that looks at this point sort of as if it's punched through the masonry. More windows here. And very nicely, what begins as a rectilinear structure, then, as you see, then is divided by mullions. Right here, the division between the two blind spaces, and then the windows are introduced. And by the time we get to the tower, we have not even noticed that the square became an octagonal structure right here. So which is really lovely. Here it is. Now there was a huge fire in the old church, but the west facade survived the fire, and the fire was at the very end of the 12th century. Not only did the facade survive the fire, but also the tunic. Everything else burned. The tunic did not burn. So that was, of course, proclaimed as a great miracle. Now this is the royal portal, and it's because it survived intact, unlike the portal in Saint-Denis. It is very important for medieval studies. The north tympana shows the ascension of Christ. Then the central tympanum is Christ in majesty or second coming, as we had discussed earlier, and then the infancy of Christ in the south tympanum, which is the first coming. So the first coming, the ascension, and the second coming, and then all sorts of sculpture around. Here, this describes the whole program. As I said, we've already seen this image as Christ in majesty, surrounded by his evangelists. Here is the Saint Mark, which is a winged lion, and Saint Luke, a winged bull. Saint John is an eagle, and an angel is Saint Matthew. And then this usually is called the chair of wisdom, or the chair of holy wisdom, when Christ child sits in the lap of his mother, and that comes from the New Testament that refers to Jesus as God's wisdom incarnate, and because he was incarnated inside the Virgin Mary. Well, the two of them here are together. And then here are the 12 apostles observing it all, and various other scenes that support the main scene. And as I said, there's so much on the royal portal. There's so much going on the royal portal, and there's so many images. It is overwhelming, and many images are in fact inscrutable, because the southern tympanum is that of the Holy Wisdom, and because Chartres Cathedral was such a center of learning. The arch vaults here are in fact dedicated to the liberal arts, to the 7 liberal arts, and you can see here images from the south arch by the 7 liberal arts right here. This is where we got our Pythagoras, in fact, that I showed to you in the beginning. Each of the liberal arts is represented by a carved personification of that art with the historical practitioner of the art. So one of the practitioners, Boethius, is Christian, and possibly there's a second one, Donatus. All the other ones are in fact pagan, because the seven liberal arts are inherited, or were inherited by Christianity from classical antiquity. The personifications are all female because of the feminine gender of the Latin word for art. And with the lower left, right here, there's Aristotle first, and then above him is logic. That stands above him, that's personification of logic. And above them is Cicero, and then rhetoric above Cicero. Then there is Euclid and geometry above Euclid, and thus it goes around the whole thing. Because progressing through the peak, then you will find arithmetic above Boethius, astronomy above Ptolemy, grammar above Priscian, who was a 6th century author of an 18-volume treatise on grammar. Or maybe it's Donatus. Here it is. And here is grammar, and she's got her work cut out for her. She's got a switch at the ready and attempting to teach two boys. One of the boys is pulling the other boy's hair. Nothing changes. And then the figures of grammar and her practitioner, they fill the final spaces on this archvolt. As a result of that, music has to move a bit. So there's music, and Pythagoras is below, who was her practitioner, and music has her instruments. So in Chartres you really see this incredible comprehensive order of the universe, and will not be until well, the beginning of the second millennium, the early second millennium, 11th, 12th century, even more so, that Christians began to dare to accept the idea that in fact the universe was imbued with a comprehensive and comprehensible order, because it was such an ancient idea, so they regarded it as pagan and as such unacceptable. But this began to change. And for the Charter masters, the liberal arts were manifestations of God's wisdom, and in the portals, God's presence was there. But the liberal arts are not alone. Usually Christ dominates the portal, and then images of Mary dominate the south portal of the south transept, and then lesser saints dominate the images of the northern portal. And here you see what is happening in the Charter. Not only the ceiling now is four-partite, but it's becoming much higher and higher. And the naval arcade, well, this is we're looking at the choir, but nevertheless is higher still and narrow. Now the gallery is abandoned. In Paris, what we saw was the triforium was abandoned in favor of light. Here they just abandoned the gallery, and instead of the gallery we do have the triforium that still makes the wall transparent, so to speak, and very, very tall windows. Now the ribs become almost like fish gills, as you see here, and we can be absolutely certain that at every point where the pressure is applied, there's a flying buttress that meets that pressure. The portal sculptures, we don't quite know who they are. They seem to be the kings and queens of the Old Testament. They're incredibly elongated, and that's what probably the sculptures looked like on Saint-Denis as well. They literally take the shape of the column. These are purely decorative. They bear absolutely no weight. They're part of the column, and they look like the columns, as you see. But what do we see below them in and between them but interlace? And here we have it. Possible that they also were emulated from medieval manuscripts, right here. And we see the very elongated figures of saints in the manuscripts, and here is one of the figures on the Chartres portal. Here again, here's the cathedral, and here is the plan. And here, very instructive to see two interiors. One is that of Laon that we saw in the beginning, and it has a four-partite elevation, as you see: the naval arcade, the gallery, the triforium, and the clerestory windows. In Chartres now, for one thing, it is higher, and the naval arcade, no more gallery, just triforium, and the clerestory windows. Chartres also has some of the earliest and most stunning stained glass windows in the world. Another difference is that Laon has a six-partite vault, as you see, which covers two bays. In Chartres, it is a four-partite vault. Each bay has its own vault, and as a result, the syncopation of the progress towards the altar is all the more pronounced. Chartres also, what we have introduced are the colonnades. Now we saw them in the Romanesque architecture as well, but Chartres here picks on that same idea, so that it's not just a large column as you see in Laon, as we also see in Paris, but it is a compounded column with colonnades going up. And there's an alternation, as you see. One column has octagonal colonnades, another has round colonnades attached to it. And then these colonnades continue all the way to the ceiling, where they meet these very strongly pronounced ribs. And here we see the same image that we saw before. Here's Laon, four-partite elevation, and this is Chartres, which is a three-partite elevation. And here's the example. This is the six-partite vault right here. As you see, it embraces two bays, and here is the four-partite vault that embraces just one bay. In Chartres also, one can truly see this called extraskeletonal architecture, this dialectic in architecture, the stone scaffolding, because here this image is from the transept and the nave meeting together, and there's enormous piers that are holding up the vault, and you see that the lines very logically now flow around the ceiling and come back, and then wherever help is needed, that's where the flying buttresses meet that thrust and counter thrusted. Everything in Chartres, everything was already designed with the flying buttresses and counting on their help. And here are some other images of the cathedral. Here again, you can see the buttresses, and you can see how the buttress is constructed. It is freestanding, it is extremely heavy, right there. And then from the main buttress, the flying buttresses then fly towards the wall and support it. Here there is schematics, because Chartres is such an incredible high-style Gothic cathedral that it is forever fascinating, and one can truly study Gothic architecture on Chartres.